This is going to be a very intensive video for my computer. What we're going to do is actually figure out which is the most efficient way and which is the best way and which is the most fun way, and try and answer every other question you could have in between there about which way you're supposed to load up your game. Actually just test it out. I'm Zealand Shannon for FMBase. Let's get it started. Hot. So more details about the way that we're going to do this test. We're going to load, I haven't actually decided how many different saves up with different iterations, basically different things that people have talked to me about. Hey, I do this, is it worthwhile? And we're just going to sim forward. So I'm going to come up with a table of 4 or 5 things, and we will check each one and then grade it. Got it? Actually get a graphic. We'll have a table, 4 or 5 things, and a letter grade below them for each of the ways to set up a save. And now we take a break in the filming because I have to go stream, and after I finish streaming, I'm gonna eat lunch, and then we're gonna set up the other 3 or 4 test databases. As you can see, I'm looking fabulous, explaining and setting up all of these databases that we're going to be testing. And of course, I didn't have any audio. There's nothing like finding out the audio didn't go through until after you've actually finished running all 6 tests. So here are the 6 types of databases that we're running tests on. The first one is the perhaps most typically recommended type of database if you're only playing as one team. And keep in mind, there are 6 of these. We tested out 3 that would work for a journeyman and 3 that would work for, you just want to play with one club or one league. This first one, we loaded in 1 league, as you can see, that was playable, and every other league was loaded on a large database all the way, every single league, all on view only. And then we had the 1 league that was playable, and that was the league that you would be able to play in theoretically. So that was our first one. Next on the list, we had a couple of my old type of saves where I would load in just the leagues that I felt like I would want to manage in at some point, and load in the leagues that I felt like I would want to sign players from. So we did a big version of that and a smaller version of that. If you don't quite have the processing power to load in, say, 110,000 players, you can only load, say, less than 6 digits worth of players and have the game run comfortably. So we did a large version of just loading in playable leagues exclusively, not all of them being playable, but loading in a bunch of the main playable leagues, then loading a few of the very main playable leagues. So those are 2 and 3. For our fourth one, we went and grabbed players from top division clubs and just threw them on top of one playable league. We picked England, made it a playable league, and then went into the custom database area, added players from top division clubs, and that was it. We left it on the custom database, and the numbers looked just about the same as a lot of our other tests. I just wanted to see if maybe that was a hiding best way to start the game. Who knows? That was number 4. I suppose we're about to know soon, but Then for our 5th database to be tested, we went with 1 team again, or 1 nation. We loaded England again, except this time we went in and we're a bit more reactive with what players came from each continent. Some continents we gave them just players that were playing for clubs in continental competition. Some continents we loaded a lot more players, like in Europe. You can see here exactly what we picked on each of them, but it was a little more reactive. Wanted to see if that would have any difference in terms of who would be loaded and who would get transferred and so on and so forth. Then we get to the last one. Now, the last one is just a mesh of basically everything we had so far. It's a bunch of playable leagues, 13, 14 leagues, with the rest on view only. Now, this is what I think is going to be the favorite in the clubhouse, especially if you're doing a journeyman save, or maybe even if you're not and you pick a particular club, but you want to have the big leagues playable and then the rest on view only with a large database. So that's our 6th and final option, and I'm going to sim each one of these 6 saves from late June, early July, whenever the start date was that I could get. I didn't start past July 1st so that we could get a full window in, to the 2nd of September 2020, which has, of course, already happened, and it wouldn't have before since I just forgot to turn my mic on. But it has already happened, so let me tell you the results. I always get too excited. I have to tell you the criteria first. So I sat down with a notepad, and I came up with the 5 things that I wanted to look for when... notepad, right here. 5 things I wanted to look for when we were going through these saves after a year. Here's what I came up with. You guys can ask to see more things in the comments if you want. I've simulated all 5, 6 into September 2nd, 2020, we have the amount of transfers that took place and the total transfer spend. So those are two separate things. The winners of the major leagues, if there were any very bizarre results, particularly in the view-only sections, the average number of youth players that are produced in the game, if I can find a way to see the number of players that are in a database at one time, then that's something I'm going to want to do. And then how continental competitions, of course, played out when you have view-only or when you have a lot of teams that aren't active in their continental competition. Basically, we're just going to be looking at the Champions League, saying continental competition just to cover bases. Who cares? So we're going to grade each of these 6 databases on these 5 areas in a school grade format. So hopefully I don't give you too much PTSD seeing a bunch of C's and D's. Just kidding. You guys were all A students, right? But really, we'll go everywhere from an A+ to an F on how well each of these databases do in these 5 categories. I'll have them pop up on the screen in some fancy way while we're going through them, and we'll hopefully do it in a pretty quick fashion so that you have your answer on which way or which type of way you should start your save in. Andale! This brings us to our first option, which is where we loaded one league and then put every other league on view only. And the league we loaded was Belgium. So here we are. Okay, the first thing we're looking for is the amount of transfers that occurred with every league on view only except for Belgium. Gone transfers up here. It's the biggest transfer we've seen in 2020. Okay, so the big transfers are still intact. We have Harry Kane going to City for under 36 million. We've got Milinkovic-Savic going to Liverpool for under 122 million. The large transfers are intact, but that's not really your worry when you're talking about every place in the world being on view only, because all the best players are going to be there. Where are the rest of the players? And when we look at it unsorted, there is a very good amount of transfers. Just grab this bar and you can see this is in the January window and in the summer. It's just a good amount of transfers. Well, I have to go B+ in terms of the number of transfers that occurred. Obviously, you would have seen more transfers if you had more people available. There actually aren't a ton of people in this database, but they do a good job when you go view only of keeping that most of the full first team and just not the rest of the club and all the important players at these clubs available. And it doesn't look like only having one league playable has actually affected the database too much when it comes to transfers. So the amount of transfers, we're going B+. In terms of net transfer spend, because a lot of the most important players and the first team players are still there, this is an A+ for net transfer spend. If you want to have an accurate amount of money flowing in and flowing out, at least for the first couple of years, this is just about the way you want to have your save set up. Moving on to number 3, it's time to check on the league winners. Now, my prediction for this, you never know, but my prediction for this is that it's going to be a little more off. And we can see that starting. Barcelona's got 2 points from his first 3 matches. Atletico won Serie A, so we're actually off to a decent start. Maybe Barcelona's just having an awful year. All right, in France, PSG won. That's pretty much par for the course. City defended the crown in the Prem. Bayern Munich defended the crown in the Bundesliga. And Napoli upset Juventus, but really no major upsets. And it also appears there was no difference in the results of being average in the view-only leagues. The results were average in the playable league, despite the fact that every other league was on view-only. So the playable league was not necessarily able to take advantage and throw itself out of whack given a year and a half. And that's what you're looking for. After a year and a half, you just want to make sure things aren't starting to skew in a direction that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. So I'm going to go ahead and give an A- for results in the top leagues when we have one playable league and the rest view only. I really don't need to repeat that every time. Next up is the average youth players. So the average number of youth players, and there's actually a nice way to figure this out. You go to transfers, and then we're going to go to youth intake. And here's what we're going to do. We're going to sort alphabetically, and we're going to look for some key clubs. And what you can already see is that the youth intakes are definitely heavily limited. The best guess here, and the only thing that really makes any sense, are the couple of players, like the 2 players that come in AC Milan's intake. When you have all of these countries on view only, those 2 players are the only players with any real potential. So these guys that are coming in at Atletico Madrid, like that's a fantastic 17-year-old from Israel, no less. With one playable league and everybody else on view only, you are only going to get players that come into youth intake if you're not in the playable league, obviously. In the playable league, you'll get everybody. But every other youth intake is only going to have players that can contribute at a first team level for that club. It does keep the numbers in the database down at a very manageable level. So if you are rolling on a small PC, you're rolling without a lot of processing power, this seems like a fantastic option to go with, and that's why I'm going to give the number of youth players a B+. Maybe I'm just an easy grader, but it gets a B+. You don't have a lot of the youth players, but you do get the important ones with that view only. So now we take a peek at the Champions League, half out of interest and half just to make sure that nothing real wonky happened. But honestly, once you see the league winners look that normal and A-OK, the fact that Bayern won it over Manchester City seems to make a lot of sense, other than the fact that neither of those teams can manage to make the Champions League final. To bring it back out here, the only limitation you would have with our first option is that it would not allow for a journeyman type of movement around the world. You only have the one playable league, but if you really don't have a lot of processing power at all and want to be able to have a lot of different leagues in the game, then this is the way to go. It's just the way to go. Or is it? We really should wait for me to talk about the other 5. On to our second option, which I've called the basic old me. What I used to do, you put on a large database in the top right corner, you load all the leagues playable. I loaded a lot of playable leagues. We can pull that up right now. All the leagues playable that you could possibly consider managing in at some point. So we've got a decent number of countries at our disposal, no particularly small ones, and time to run through the checklist. And the transfer spend is looking like it checks out. A good hearty number of high money transfers. All the important players are A-OK and in this database, and the transfer spend is, yeah, it's an A-. It's just a little better than the last one. That's not a surprise because this type of database is going to take a lot more processing power. As for the amount of transfers, well, then we're going to go ahead and say that the amount of transfers is actually, it's an A. The amount of transfers doesn't seem quite the same, which is a little strange to me, and you might be able to chalk that up to statistical variance. Obviously, I don't have the computing power to run this test 100 times, and then there's no way to quantify these numbers, so I'm going to go ahead and give it an A. It seems like there were just a few less transfers than we had in the other database, but that, honestly, it has to be a statistical anomaly. Doesn't matter. There are no problems with the amount of transfers in our first 2 options. The basic old me way of loading up a game, the way I've always done it, is holding up pretty well when it comes to the transfers. While we're here, we might as well just look at the youth intake. That's easy enough. Already looking better. So in this database, you're obviously going to get a much more well-rounded experience. You see the numbers are much higher for each club. One thing I do want to check is how does the youth intake do outside of the leagues that have been loaded as playable, because that's kind of important. Which means now we will go look for the best Welsh team, the New Saints, and see if they had a youth intake or not. And they did. So that's actually very impressive. Not in the game, but since we have the large database, we're getting a pretty wholesome youth intake outside of the playable leagues. We're going A+. A+ on the youth intake section for the old me strategy here. This is nice. It's just 24 different nations loaded with a large database, so less than half of the nations loaded, and you're still going to get a really wholesome youth intake that's going to help fill in the game. Obviously, in 15 to 20 years down the line in the game, it's going to start to run a little slower. There'll be a lot more players in the game than there were initially, which is an advantage of the one before. But in terms of those first 10, 12 years, you get a nice wholesome experience with a ton of youth players, very realistic experience. I was onto something the first time I started playing the game. That's awesome. I just did a quick check around all 5 top leagues. Obviously, all of them are playable, so as you would expect, we get an A+ for accuracy when portraying the competition. Now on to the Champions League. And the final is Juventus Liverpool. Hey, Liverpool at least finally won the Prem. If they don't choke it away in real life, they'll have it too, so good for them. Time for our third one. This, instead of picking 24 different nations that we're going to load in, all the nations that we find interesting, we're going to pick a lot less with a large database and see how that grades out. Transfer spend is actually a little more excessive, which means I'm going to go ahead and give this an A-. We see only 2 transfers of over 100 million really in the last 2 databases. Well, this one actually has more, and I'm going to go ahead and assume that's because there aren't quite as many other players available. That might be an improper assumption. I'm going to go ahead and give this an A- for its transfers. That's what I've seen. But it does, however, get an A+ for the amount of transfers, because that didn't change at all from a database that was twice the size. So you still see a ton of movement and not nearly as much complacency within teams as I expected to see. Youth intake looks fantastic. In particular, what's fantastic about it is that with the large database, you are still getting significant youth intakes outside of the nations that have been loaded. I'm going to go ahead and give the youth intakes an A-. They don't seem perfect. They seem to have shortchanged a couple of the teams that aren't in, but you still are getting a larger youth intake than we had with our first option. And with what we know is all of the top leagues being loaded as playable, we can go ahead and award an A+ for accuracy of results in the top leagues in Europe. For the Champions League, you can expect an easier competition because you are just not going to be going up against full teams if they aren't one of the leagues that's loaded as playable, where loading a league as view only is going to give you most of the first team. Loading a large database can be a little more hit and miss. So if you are playing a team from Slovakia, and Slovakia can produce some decent teams that can compete for Champions League group stages in the odd occasion, well, that team's going to have a few more grayed out players, or there's a chance that it could, because it's not uniformly balanced by the view only. So you're sacrificing that for better youth intake with a similar amount of processing power. That being said, it doesn't affect the top of the Champions League, so A- to European competition. Let's move on. So now things are going to get really interesting, and I want you to see my live reaction because I honestly have no idea what we're going to find. In option 4 out of 6, what I've done is gone into a custom database, and depending on the continent, added a specific group of players. Now, somewhat remarkably, with only one league playable and all of those loaded in, I'm going to go ahead and give a B+ to the amount on transfers as well. We see a really significant transfer spend, and again, only England is playable. No other league is view only. So if we're on PSG, you can see the reason the transfers are still normal is even though the league is not actually viewable, there are more players than if this was on view only. We see that stats are being maintained for these players. This was the most haphazard one I put together. The one next is the one where I put every continent on the same thing. As for the amount of transfers, just out of sheer surprise, I'm going to go with A+. Not having the leagues playable or view only and not having the specific results being calculated nearly as aggressively as they would even be on view only, we're still getting a tremendously accurate, large amount of transfers between clubs. Obviously, the majority of them are not loaded. Like these teams that are making moves are all over the world. Here's where it could be the sticker, though. Youth intake was okay, too. It's going to get a B-. Youth intake is because after going through the scroll, you see Cologne only getting 1. The youth intake is very unbalanced, but you do see a lot of players that are not in England that are getting youth intake players. The concern, the reason it gets the B- is as you play 10, 15 years into the save. I didn't have time, obviously, to simulate that far in advance in order to test out this theory, but as you get farther and farther ahead, you're going to start to get grayed out players in the top teams of some of these different leagues that you might be competing against. It's a very surface level simulation everywhere except for the one place that you're playing, right? So we're going to go C+ on the top league results. So because most of the players are loaded, you are going to get a realistic Champions League or continental competition experience wherever you are. Champions League reality, I'm going to go with a B- because obviously as we go on, the Champions League reality is going to go down. Well, this last one loads, which it's actually already finished loading. Good job, me. If you've enjoyed the video so far, you found it helpful, you appreciate the effort, if you could hit the like button down below, that would mean a lot. Also, if you want to see more videos like this, you can subscribe to the channel. We upload 2 videos a week, try and make them very informative, do tests, do searches, do scouting efforts, and all this different stuff to give you the best information you can possibly have about Football Manager. I also stream on Twitch. If you want to just hang out with me personally, you can like that. I got a couple of links down below, including my Discord. You can come in and just ask me questions in the question section, or do what everybody does, not listen to me say you can ask questions in the question section and just slide into my Discord DMs. That's cool too. You can do that. So here's our 5th option, which is one playable league and the top division club or top division players from every club are loaded into the game. Every club in the world. Once again, I'm going to go B when it comes to transfer spend because it drops off pretty quickly as you scroll down. But this is a solid effort when it comes to the amount of money that was spent in transfers for having one league loaded as playable. The amount of transfers, though, it checks out. Again, we have to give an A+. For the amount of transfers, it will feel natural. Players will be moving around. But what we're really interested in is the sustainability of the save at this point, since it seems all of our options are going to be at least pretty good when it comes to transfers, much to my surprise. The issue here is I'm going to the clubs that are not in the top flights. We're getting a very limited youth intake. So we are going to end up in a situation where the clubs in the top of their divisions, the promotion and relegation is not going to be nearly as severe. But if you make your one nation playable, that promotion and relegation is going to be very severe and feel natural. But you do still get youth intake of the good players from the lower levels, especially considering the intakes are going to be completely natural for every top club. So every club in the first division, if you're trying to win the Champions League, this is a more sustainable way to go. For the Champions League and general continental competition, the grade's going to be a B+. I'm going to have to go ahead and cash out a C+ when it comes to league results as well. Let's get to the final one, and the one I think is going to be the favorite for this specific test, just to see how things would happen. I loaded different levels of leagues, so you got Wales, you have Italy, Belarus, US. Different levels of leagues is playable, then literally every other nation is on view only. Large database, obviously. This is pretty easy to run large database when you're on view only. It is. Right off the top, I'm already loving this. Very realistic looking transfers. This is going to get a clean A from me. For realistic in terms of the amount of money being spent on transfers, this is fantastic. Amount of transfers, right on again, A+. Pretty much every database and the way that the transfers have been loaded in and the way that they've gone during our year of simulation has been bang on. So any one of those options, you're going to get an appropriate amount of transfers. There's going to be no real issue with the exchanging of players and honestly the money either. Now on the youth intake, we're going to be in a great situation because it's a combination of the view only. So if every league in the world is on view only, there's going to be a concentrated effort to get the best players in that youth intake to actually appear. Not the full youth intake, but the best players. And then in playable leagues, you're going to get a full in-depth youth intake. So if you know you don't want to manage in a league, putting them on view only is still going to contribute the most talented youngsters to the game without even messing with the database size at all. And you can see how the league plays out. And the countries that you want full youth intakes from, Argentina, Brazil, etc., then you put as playable, and they will be those full uploads. And this is still able to run on pretty low processing power. It gives you options for journeyman. Sorry, I'm already giving my full wrap up. Youth intake A+. At this point, now that we've done a lot of our research, it's exactly what we could have expected. The league results are going to go ahead and be an A, and depending on what playable nations that you're going to load, the Champions League is going to be very sustainable. Even if you load some pretty random nations as playable and have to sacrifice maybe one of the big five, leaving it on view only is going to give you an authentic match experience. It's going to give you a realistic looking table, and your Champions League is going to be able to sustain. So I'm going to go AA+. Because a sustainable Champions League is a real problem with some different ways that people try and load databases in. So our final summation. We ended up trying out a couple of different ideas. There's those people that think if you go into the custom database, life is going to be easier. They're the people that you think you need to go all view only. The people that, like I didn't really know about view only for a long time, just put playable and then large database and realize that players from other countries are still going to load into that large database, and you can still get the Wonder Kid from Iraq if you really look for it. Thank you, Mahmoud. Depending on what kind of processing power you have, determines what type of save you should do and can do while getting a wholesome experience. If you don't have a lot of processing power, I would recommend going one playable league or 4 or 5 playable leagues and going view only. If you do have a lot of processing power, I'd recommend going 30 playable leagues and then going view only, because the playable leagues don't just stick one playable league and go view only everywhere no matter what. Even if you only want to manage in one country, those 25-30 playable leagues are going to give you a better youth intake experience, a slightly better transfer experience, and more sustainability in your saves so that you can go 20, 30, 40 years 40 years. If you've actually gone 40 years, please let me know in the comments. I love sustainable saves, and you get more sustainability having playable leagues that you don't even necessarily plan on playing in. And then putting the rest on view only is going to keep your database from exploding too much, because those clubs on view only are actually going to go down in roster size over time, while your playable leagues are going to go up. So you'll be pretty balanced. You really should only go into custom databases if you're trying to set up a very particular thing, or if you're looking to do international management, but that sounds like a topic for another video, which you'll have to subscribe to get a notification for. You could still watch it. I love you guys. Thank you. I know this was a long one, but it was important to get through all these different options and different tests, and I'm a curious guy. I'll see you guys on Thursday. Double deuces.